Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for LawCats Live here at the University of Arizona. I am Teresa Miguel Stearns, the new director of the Law Library here at Arizona Law. I'm also an alum of the iSchool, so it's a real treat and a joy for me to be back in Tucson and back on campus, even if only virtually for the moment. We have a fantastic panel today, as you know. We have former Dean and Regents Professor Tony Massaro, we have Professor Justin Pideaux, and Dr. Marvin Slepian, also a Regents Professor in Medical and Engineering School, and he's also a second-year law student here at Arizona Law. So he plays a dual role in his capacity with us today. And we're here to discuss their recent essay on constitutional norms for pandemic policy. I invite everyone to read this incredibly thoughtful and practical paper if you haven't already. It's a wonderful example of constitutional law influencing and guiding our actions at this time. We'll have a question and answer period during the session, which will take place in about 20 minutes or so after the panelists answer a few questions around their paper and their work. We are scheduled to go until 1 p.m., at which time I will officially close the session, but the panelists have agreed to stick around for a little while and answer additional questions if there are any. So please feel free to submit any questions that come to you during the course of this session through the Q&A button at the bottom. If you look to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a participants button, and within there, a question and answer button. The webinar will be recorded and posted at a future date on our Arizona Law website. Finally, please check the Arizona Law calendar for upcoming events. So as we begin this session, I'd like to provide a little bit of context for their paper and for today's session. All four of us are members of the new Safe Return Committee. This is the College of Law's committee that is preparing the formal plan to return to in-person activities on the College of Law campus this fall. Dean Miller constituted this committee at the end of April at the direction of the provost. Every college on campus has a similar committee, and we've been working steadily since then. The core committee is actually 9 faculty and staff members. We have 8 different working groups in which we formally pulled another 30 or so faculty, staff, and even students. So there are a lot of people at the College of Law working this summer to ensure as safe a return to campus as we possibly can, while ensuring that we are still able to deliver a high quality legal education to our students. These working groups that I mentioned cover every aspect of life at the College of Law, from instruction to extracurriculars, from communications to community support, from the plan for all the people, staff, faculty, and students, to the plan for all the space. We've been living and breathing this work for nearly 3 months. So we're looking forward to sharing some of our thoughts, insights, and experiences with you today, and learning from you as well through your questions. So with all this in mind, let's jump right in. So Dr. Slepian, I'll begin with you. Tell us something that we know, tell us something we don't know about COVID, or tell us something you don't know about COVID, which makes planning for the fall so challenging.
Let me, first of all, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on this program with everyone here today. Just by way, thank you for the introduction. Just by way of introduction, I have a long history actually in virology. I started as a young student interested with the goal of being a virologist. So there are a lot of principles of virology that are actually well understood. But if you ask me that question, I have to sort of answer it from this perspective. What I've held up here for the group to see is that this is really a multi-dimensional problem, multi-dimensional question that we're going to get into as far as addressing a new safe return or opening. So what I'm showing you here is that the individual, the group, and society, there are unknowns there, and that's the domain of law. But if you ask me what we don't know about coronavirus, that's in the science domain in terms of how it affects an organ or a cell. So what do I not know about coronavirus, along with a lot of other scientists and virologists? We don't understand a lot of some of the technical aspects in terms of how it binds to a cell or particularly how it replicates or what the role of certain proteins are. But is that important to you? No. What's really important and what we don't understand, and what I don't understand, is back to that multidimensional level. Why do individuals not understand the gravity of this type of situation? And frankly, it has a lot to do with education. And we'll come back to this theme, but as we get into this sort of constitutionally guided discussion, if we would just figure out a very simple way to educate individuals, that would be very effective to provide a rational basis to further operate. So I think that's a pretty good lead in to where we want to go here today. And let's move on from that question. We'll be coming back to a lot of these points, I'm sure.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Slepian. Professor Padot, what is the public policy pickle you address in your paper?
Thank you for that question. And it's just, let me also just say, it's such an honor to be working with this august group. I've only been at Arizona for a year, so I came from the University of Denver and from the federal government. So it's been quite a year to join the faculty. I don't really remember what my office looks like most of the time, but occasionally I come back in. Figuring out how to return to public life as safely as possible is a really thorny problem, a pickle, as you said, in part because of the weighty interests on either side. If we were only concerned about public health and specifically reducing transmission of the virus, there's a number of very robust interventions we could pursue. Keep everyone at home, enforce quarantines, sort of put a stop to all communal life until there is an effective either treatment or there's immunity or whatever, right? So, but doing that would cost a lot. It would cost a lot to the economy. It would cost a lot to us personally. I don't know about you, but sitting home isolated day on day is really hard. It would cost a lot to families. And of course, there are many members of our community that simply can't stay at home because they don't have the financial resources to be without work. So that isn't an option. It's not a good option. And instead, we have to take account of all of these other weighty concerns in developing a plan that can allow us to return, but also ensure a degree of public safety. Now, this task is further complicated by the fact that unlike some public policy issues, planning for returns is going to require a lot of buy-in and a lot of cooperation from all of the members of society. Requiring people to wear masks, for example, only works if people do wear masks. And I, for one, am skeptical that we can effectively punish people for not wearing masks and have that be our solution. We need to have buy-in. We need to have people willing to participate in the kinds of rules of the road that we create. And that means that we need to have a plan that creates confidence. And it also needs to create confidence for those who are scared, right? People will not leave their homes unless they feel like it's safe for them to do so, or at least there's some degree of safety. Put differently, we need to reach consensus both amongst those who would prefer the government to stay out, in other words, for them to be able to do whatever they want, and for those who are very fearful. Because for those who oppose any regulation, they will not get what they want unless others feel safe returning to the public square. Not much of a return to economic and social life if you leave your house without a mask and find no one to talk to. On the other hand, for those who are concerned about the rules of the road, those rules will only be as effective as sort of the participation of all of us. So there is an opportunity here. Indeed, there is a demand here for us to find common cause and figure out a path through the thicket that most of us can agree to, or at least live with. And I think that is sort of creating a path, sort of finding the contours of that path is the point of our paper, trying to figure out how we might go about developing a pandemic policy, a set of policies to guide returns that most people can live with, that accommodate the important liberty and economic interests of those who are itching to get out of their homes, and also create confidence in those who are fearful to leave their homes.
Thank you, Professor Padot. Professor Massaro, there seems, there's clearly a disunity that Professor Padot referred to. Do you think there really is a path forward that can vault this disunity, that can lead to consensus?
I don't think we can vault it. I think we can bridge it better through some paths than others. We are not naive, but we are also, as you said up top, we're pragmatic, and we're knee deep in this. This is on, as the kids would say. It's happening, and we don't have choices about whether or not we go forward. And it's not some hypothetical question of law or policy. This is something that Americans are engaged in right now, and a lot of us in all these different settings. So how do we do that in better ways? I mean, there are better and worse ways to do it. We think, or what the thesis of the paper is, we think the ingredients for consensus do exist, and they ought to be leveraged and emphasized. Even if they are often obscured by political and policy rancor. And of course, everybody in the world thinks they're a virologist now, but we're not. And all of that is part of the oleo of problems that we're facing. Okay, so what do we agree on? Everybody wants to safely return to our families, our jobs, our schools, our places of assembly, worship, pubs, parks, and all these other settings that make up human lives. We're missing weddings and funerals and each other. And this is something we have in common, and that ought to be emphasized in a way I think would be a pathway to the empathic spark that would knit us together. But we also have ideas or basic norms that we share. And you could say they're derived from constitutional law, or you could say they're reflected in constitutional law. I think it's more the latter, and they conform with the kind of basic intuition that needs to be part of this done right. Okay, what are these norms that should inform better conditional returns? Until there's a vaccine, these are conditional returns. It's not full on, let's just go run with abandon, maskless, coughing at each other. That cannot happen, right? So where might we begin? The paper sets out a framework. First thing, and for those who've had some law training, it should be, well, that's familiar. I hope it's familiar. Constitution is the lingua franca. This is something we're supposed to share. Baseline, and they're really derived from due process and equal protection. 1, substantive rationality. Government, but here too, private actors who have authority over us, should do things that are based on facts and reason and a sound public policy, or in private settings, private policy. That means in the case of a disease, it needs to be science forward. We have to have the best available research and knowledge about the virus and its risks, and policy planners should all have a Dr. Slepian to help them shape and explain to the public what this is and why the policy is sound. In my world, that's called a rational basis. And secondly, it's important that we set conditions that have a rational basis too, that can be articulated, that we have a link between this goal and the measures that we adopt in going forward. That's also part of this baseline procedure. But then there's also something everybody has the right to expect. The bigger the invasion of your liberty, the more process you want. Notice an opportunity to be heard. If the employer is going to condition your return, you want to know what the conditions are. And if you are someone caught in the web of you should not do X because of Y, the more grave the interference with your liberty, the more process you should be entitled to make sure that they've accurately determined that you're someone who falls in that zone. And so where it's feasible to individualize those kinds of process opportunities, I think it should happen. It's not always going to be feasible, but that's not true across other settings as well. It depends on the gravity. So you want a rational rule, rational means and rational process, and feedback opportunities. And these things are intuitive, but sometimes ignored when people are planning. If they just medicalize it, which is important, they'll be missing this. There's a third big thing, and it's being advanced by a lot of people, and that is my rights, my liberty, right? Americans share respect for fundamental liberties, and some are above the fold. Free speech, freedom of religion, you know, the big ones, things that we consider fundamental to ordered liberty. This does not mean, it doesn't anywhere else, and it doesn't here, that they cannot be infringed. It says when they are infringed, that the policymakers need to take special care. For example, if contact tracing turns out to be essential for effective virus management, and contact tracing has long been a tool used for pandemics, then worrying about the privacy and other spillover of it, insofar as possible, we should try to protect personal identity and use of it in order to continue to promote the sound end of public health without sacrificing too much of the liberty on these other sides. So in con law parlance, these policies need to be narrowly tailored to avoid as possible invasions of core values. But no core value is absolute. You know that from law school, you know that life, you know that from thinking about these things for 2 seconds about collective life. And finally, equality matters. It took until after the Civil War to put the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution, but that was a mistake that was corrected. Equality matters, and COVID policies and COVID itself, we need to be mindful that there's a disparate impact that's happening because of the virus, and that's going to require equality to attend to differences among us in order to see to it that some of us don't pay a much higher price. But it also is a kind of rationality. If you have a policy about large gatherings, make sure insofar as you can that all cognate similar large gatherings are treated the same, so that you can say to the one who says, why me and not you? You can answer that in a way that would be intuitive and to portray that the policymakers has thought about it. So fact, reasons matter, process, rights matter, and equality matters. But as Dr. Slepian said, you're going to have to communicate effectively about all of this, and thus the way we appeal to each other is going to matter. And we think that appealing from the unum and not the plurus, appealing from this commonplace might better trigger the social cooperation, empathy, and understanding of the disparate impact. We are in this together. We sink or swim together. But again, I'm not naive. I see what's happening in our country, in our communities. But I also think that if you give up, shame on you. And you know, we're doing this for our footprint, the law school, but I think we've got something to say about how these things ought to proceed in every other setting. And we think all the people on this call and all the people in leadership positions throughout the country can really help turn this into a pandemic in which it pulls us together rather than apart.
Thank you, Professor Massaro. This is a very clear framework for analyzing the problem and for a path forward, but how do we apply these principles if we can't even agree as a society on the science? And Dr. Slepian, let me start with you on this question.
Sure. Well, let me weigh in.
Yeah.
I think, you know, first of all, we actually can agree on the science. The issue that's going on is that you have this purported disagreement out in the public based on media, based on, let's say, the lack of leadership that clearly exists in various agencies and government, et cetera, the lack of clear messaging. If you speak to any medical person, if you speak to anyone deep in microbiology or virology, we understand this situation very, very well. Yes, as I said in the beginning, when you asked me the first question, there are nuances on what protease and what replicase and all those technical things, but that doesn't matter. The most basic thing is if I were to poll the audience, if I were to poll our panelists, which I will not do, if I were to ask most of us, what is the difference between a virus and a bacteria? How do they work? How do they replicate? How do they move through the environment? I'm not being pompous. I guarantee, and I've already done this, the minority of people have the right answers. Now, I'm not sitting here on high belittling anyone. I'm saying that this is such an easy thing to educate, and it's actually an exciting thing. This is how my career started. I actually started with the thought of being a virologist. And in fact, I brought out from the files here, here's a picture that I took 45 plus years ago on the cover of my own high school science magazine of viruses that I isolated. And I worked in virology for over 20 years. And I still am involved in my lab as far as viral interactions with the heart and other things. The point is, a virus is an obligate parasite that requires a host. Bacteria live on their own. Fungi, the same thing. So without a host, there is no virus. Let's get that message out. That's a really simple message, and we can amplify on that, meaning if there's no you in the equation mulling around, there is no amplification of this virus and the pandemic goes away. Now we can flavor that many different ways. That means wear a mask, don't spread it. Don't congregate, don't allow the virus to jump from A to B. There are so many other aspects that can be intelligently communicated that frankly, they are apolitical because RNA does not lie. This is a chemical situation. The fun part on the science side is, I have a great friend, George Whitesides at Harvard. He would say, you know, this is nanotechnology, but it's chemistry because this is chemistry in action. And that will not change. So that is immutable. We cannot argue about that. And those basic principles are there. So you build this rational basis on substantive rationality. There's your substance. Viruses require an obligate host. If you take the host out of the equation through behavioral and other modifications, this thing will quiet down and go away. Point number one. Point number two, you have to apply, in only a student here, constitutional parlance, you have to apply this across the domains that Professor Massaro outlined in terms of it has to be done on an equal basis in terms of equality. It has to be done with equal treatment. It has to be done with respect to fundamental liberties because you will be invading some a little bit. But if you're doing a balancing test of why one is more important than the other, it becomes very clear. So a lot of this political foment and a lot of the brouhaha would go away if we really start with a lot of educational points. I want to show one quick thing that I put together. And I think education should be on the up, on the positive, because frankly, there are more Nobel Prizes in medicine and chemistry related to virology than probably most other areas, because it's the most fundamental aspect of life. Viruses are actually very helpful from that perspective if you treat them correctly. In fact, in the origins of bacterial viruses, they wanted to use them as a therapy to get rid of bacteria. So there's a lot of value for that. So if I could share the screen for just 30 seconds, I'll show this. Now, if you don't get the message across with pure education, there's always a little bit of a scare tactic done tastefully. And we're all old enough to remember on the left the concept about drug and drug abuse. So this is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. And there's the impact. So I created one for the virus. Here's your lung. Here's the coronavirus. But this is your lung on coronavirus. This is totally preventable. And this is from a patient, very young, who recently underwent a lung transplant because of the ravages of the disease. We don't have to subject anybody to that. Wear a mask. It's pretty simple. So there are many ways to kind of move beyond, and I can go on, but I'm going to stop and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Slepian. So I obviously asked the wrong question about disagreeing on the science. Before we go to Q&A, let me just revise that question and give it to Professor Padot. And so maybe the better question is, how do we apply these principles of constitutional law in our planning if we can't agree upon what's sensible?
Yeah, that is the trick. I mean, I think what Professor Massaro talked about provides the starting ground. We need to elevate the consensus that we already share, right? No one wants to stay at home few people want to wear a mask for mask's sake, right? We want to find ways that we can congregate and interact and learn. And so I think emphasizing those commonalities and emphasizing that in the absence of cooperation, we cannot reach that shared vision. That's the way forward. So I think about it very practically here at the law school. I'm sure we have students who will not be happy with some of the mitigation measures we require, like wearing a mask. They want to come to school. They want things to be sort of a return to normal. And so how do I convince a student who says, I don't want to wear a mask at the law school, to do so anyway? Well, I think the best way to do that for me is not to try necessarily to persuade them that they should agree that wearing a mask is sensible, but rather to explain that if they don't wear a mask, there will be no professors here to teach them, right? The thing they want to have in-person interactions in a classroom is dependent on everyone agreeing to a shared set of common rules. And I think that's a message that people can understand, and it allows people to find common cause without necessarily having to reach an agreement on sort of issues that have become so ideologically divided.
But if I can weigh in just for a second, you know, again, I go back to the fact that if you still create the base, you know, I take it, I'm coming from the perspective of a 40-year-plus physician who deals with very difficult situations where people just, you know, come at it at a sort of initial level where they don't believe it. There's disregard. If you spend the time, not to politically try to convince anybody, but just to educate them in a very soft, very scientific, simple way, making sure that they understand, not in a threatening way, that works. It works a lot. It will not necessarily work for everyone, but that is a very good starting ground beyond having it to be more of an authoritarian debate. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for that. I'd like to turn to some of the questions now. And the first for Professor Massaro. Is there a cognizable equal protection or disparate impact challenge to government's COVID policies, or lack thereof, based on the large discrepancy of virus impacts on communities and individuals of color, as set forth in the recent CDC guidance that we've all seen?
Well, there's no short answer to that question. Let me run through the basic. I mean, there's the constitutional doctrinal answer, and then there's the norms that animate the doctrine. The doctrinal answer, generally speaking, equal protection violations by government, even in the context of race, are ones where disparate impact isn't sufficient. There has to be discriminatory intent. People very much disagree about whether that's a sufficient protection of equal protection for all. The paper is less, although we talk about that doctrinal implementation, we spend more time talking about the norm that animates equality. The disparate impacts are foreseeable. The disparate impacts are documented. The disparate impacts are horrific, and I think should call upon all of us to try to respond to them. That's for communities of color. We see it with tribal communities. Here in Arizona, the Navajo Nation has been coping with this from the beginning and is continuing to. Again, I think that that's an example of the disparate impact, that if the law doesn't do something about it, we should. It's the equality norm, and I think that's something that we should anticipate. If you know that there's a foreseeable disparate impact on a vulnerable population, or know that the primary remedy or protective measure is wash your hands often, and you know that a significant number of fellow people don't have running water or access to it, again, I'm back to, that's not sound public policy. So the equality principles matter even when they don't actually give you a solution that's judicially enforceable.
Right. Thank you.
Does that answer the question? I don't know if you can tell them.
Well, we don't have interaction, but I think it does answer the question. Thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Dr. Slepian, very briefly, what do you consider to be the best first source of publicly available information regarding coronavirus?
You know, I'm privileged to a lot of different sources. I think that the best thing is, clearly, I would still go with the CDC has good information. The NIH has good information. I think that several of the medical societies have put out very good information. I happen to be president of the American Society of Artificial Organs. We actually have an action site, which if you go to that, it's when we can make that available, asaio.org, and you hit the yellow button, it has 1 million links. And that's sort of a common clearinghouse site for a lot of things. And there are many others, the American Heart Association, American Lung Association. I think that each state has information about data. It depends upon what you're trying to find. If you're looking for information on numbers, the Hopkins site clearly is the best. And there's also the Harvard Public Health Initiative. That's another good site. If you're looking for a warehouse site, we have a site. If you're looking for specifics about particular science, you know, go to the best journals, look at Science and Nature. They're always giving information about what the latest thing is. So that's the answer.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Slepian. And this next question, it brings in a whole lot of different areas of ethics, constitutional law, medicine. Recently, there's been talk about how to distribute vaccines and therapeutic treatments once they become available. There are public health, legal and moral questions, and any thoughts about who gets to be at the front of the line?
There you go.
I'm gonna say something about that. We're not writing on a clean slate. The university has had for years exercises that respond to exactly those questions, and that's a terrific question. There are protocols. There are ways in which planning, you wouldn't think so in a way, watching how things have rolled out, the extent to which there are protocols in place, and they anticipate federal and state cooperation and some tragic choices too. The simplest answer is it's kind of like the essential services mandate, that we would first have to provide those vaccines and interventions to healthcare workers and others on whom the rest of us depend. And I suppose there would also be some moral questions about diagnosis and prognosis, et cetera. You can run, but you can't hide from the hard choices. It's why absolutism with respect to rights, my liberty over yours, are ultimately non-starters. Or maybe they're starters, but they shouldn't be conversation stoppers.
Let me just
Go ahead. You know more about this than I do, Justin.
Well, I don't know about that, but I guess to answer the question in the negative, I think there are some principles that should not be the basis for distributing a vaccine. So one, probably the easiest way to distribute a vaccine in our country will be to those who have enough money to buy it. And that is not the right way to distribute a vaccine. It won't be a right way morally. It won't be the right way from a public health standpoint. So we should not let the market be the only driver for distributing vaccines, would be the first thing I'd say. And then the second thing I would say, and I wish I felt like I didn't have to say this, but it shouldn't be a question of political favoritism. Right? We shouldn't have government designing how to distribute vaccines so that those who are perceived as political allies have first dibs, either within this country or on the international stage. Right? That's not, I think that is a morally abhorrent way of distributing sort of a life-saving tool like this. So within, with those exceptions, I think there's probably a lot of space for discussion amongst policy experts in cooperation with doctors, in cooperation with people in government to figure out exactly where your first targets are and how you sort of move a vaccine into the population. But I think there are things we need to be on the lookout for to make sure that that isn't how we're proceeding.
I think just to echo on that, I agree totally with what's been said by both of our panelists. But I think actually it's a lot easier to agree on what are the things that the negative things, as Professor Patel has talked about, because then it becomes easier to really operate. And then you operate really on a hierarchical and practical basis in terms of risk versus need and services that are provided and other things. For instance, on the medical side, who are we going to provide this to? People in the ICU, much more than someone who's in a clinic. People who are in the emergency room, much more than someone who's doing some type of telehealth situation. So that type of hierarchy of risk and efficacy is pretty easy to work out, particularly with the involved groups. And then you create a balance. And the reality is that once the vaccine really starts, and there will be several different vaccines that I believe will come out, it should ramp pretty well. And that's easier to deliver than testing. You know, delivering and dispensing a drug, it should be easier than the whole business about testing because it's much more encumbered.
Thank you all. So this next question is for Dean Massaro specifically, but I would invite, of course, all of our panelists to respond. What is the appropriate government action for protests, whether it be a protest against racial injustice or a protest against a lockdown measure? Should the responses be equal? What should they look like? Are the benefits worth the costs of the government action, and who should make the call? Or does health take priority?
Well, there's almost too much packed into that. You know, the way I'd walk through it is free speech is not absolute, but it's a core value. That's one of the fundamentals. One, you know it's limited. You can't cry fire falsely in a crowded theater. If it's on fire, you better get your hiney gula out of there. But there are limits, and there are limits that apply contextually, not all contexts, and all kinds of ways in which our free speech is bounded. But it's true, protests are an American core place, public fora, and in that context, the rules should be, insofar as possible, to protect the right of dissent, and to do so equally, regardless of the viewpoint or ideology of the dissenter, while anticipating the need to secure the safety of others. Now, the due process clause, you know, it's life first, liberty, property. Life needs to be maintained. If there are justifiable limits, then they should be applied even-handedly in order to preserve maximally the opportunity for protest. But I think that life is a heavy, meaty thumb on the scale. So, it depends. It depends, and it depends on going back to the knowledge and application, and if there's a less restrictive way to secure the life part while protecting the free speech liberty part, then that's the way policy planners ought to go about it.
Right. Thank you. Switching back to medicine, to ethics, to what extent, if at all, do you think the formal cost-benefit analysis with quality-adjusted life years and economic cost calculations would be helpful in making some of the determinations? And I think we've seen this around the world at various times.
Yeah, let me jump in. I mean, I was skirting around that when I sort of talked about risk-benefit, and I knew that might come up.
Yeah.
You know, now you're getting into ethics and other aspects, and that becomes a very, very difficult thing to deal with. I mean, there are some generalities. You know, we have to deal with the same thing. I'll be very specific in my domain where we're dealing with heart transplantation. You know, there are a limited number of donor organs. You have to make some choices. So, and therefore, age above a certain age becomes an issue. On the other hand, we're very particular on that. So, if you have someone delivering a particular service or very vital or otherwise, there will always be some exceptions. Now, as Professor Prideaux talked about, it gets a little bit more murky when those exceptions have to do with privilege and they have to do with the ability to pay and other things. So again, I would respectfully take that back out of the equation. But to me, that is not an absolute, but it's a general guideline. I mean, if someone is 95 years old, the you know, actuarial tables will tell you, you know, what their survival is, you know, based on something. So I think that does play in. But you get into a murky zone when we're dealing with young characters that are in their 60s and 70s and others, you know, that we're young characters. So we, there you go. I didn't say anything wrong, sorry.
All right.
Add one thing to this. I mean, So I think that using a cost-benefit framework, although generally not one that is designed to monetize everything. I mean, there are incommensurable values that are at stake here, but being clear-eyed about what's at stake, both with an intervention and with a decision not to intervene, to make that concrete, with a decision to issue a stay-at-home order, what are the costs that come along with that? And there are serious ones. And what are the benefits that come along with that? And there are serious ones. That's the kind of transparent government process that should occur. That's a way to invite the public to understand what the decision and to offer counter views. Now, I think too often the framework for cost-benefit analysis becomes one that is manipulated for ideological purposes. So to give one example, I think it is wrong to think about the decision to issue a stay-at-home order purely in terms of how many lives are saved, because there are lots of health consequences from COVID that are beyond simple death. And so we need to have a robust understanding both of what costs and benefits we can identify and an understanding of the uncertainty in those determinations. But thinking about those things is vital, and communicating with the public about those things is vital, because that's where political accountability comes from, right? Political accountability occurs when our leaders can explain how they valued lives and health versus the economy, and also lives and health, right? I mean, there's lives and health on both sides here. So I think it's a helpful framework, but I'm pretty resistant to making it a cold economic calculus that says $1 million saved versus $1 million cost, because embedded in any kind of calculus like that is the kinds of political decisions that should be made transparently about how we value life, how we value health, how we value liberty.
Agree totally.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Massaro, I think we have time for one last question. And at the end of the paper, you all talk about the dual effect, or the dueling effects even, of the infringements on life, liberty, and property. How infringements both safeguard and protect liberty at the same time. Could you elaborate on this piece a little bit more?
Sure. There's none of us is, to play with the phrase, alone in our liberty. There are some moments in which you could say I'm engaged in an exercise of my liberty in an entirely private context in which there's no spillover consequence for others. But that's actually rare. I think, and going back to the founding period, we weren't founded on principles of pure libertarianism. It was a civic republic. We're living in this cooperative way, and we're giving up liberties in order to become part of a community, a political community, and other types of communities, and private communities too. So, if you're a runner, you want to run down the street and you say, oh, I'm so glad to have this free moment. I'm going to take my mask off and I'm going to sweat and I'm going to cough and I'm downwind and slow moving through space behind you and in a CDC vulnerable group. You're having a liberty experience, and I'm not having such a liberty experience. I'm thinking maybe I go home, right? This is what you need to understand, I think, or take into account of. Put another way, your autonomy to swing your arms stops when you connect with my nose. And again, your right to yell whatever you want, free speech, doesn't include yelling fire falsely in a crowded theater. We need to be able to think about kind of cooperative liberalism. That liberalism matters to us, by which I mean a libertarian protection of rights and pride, all the things we care so much about. But we also have to think about our fellow human beings, and again, as I started, I might want to play Russian roulette at home, but that doesn't mean I can come to school and play it with a shotgun with my students potentially vulnerable around me. That's not how it rolls. That's not freedom. That's something else. That's something twisted. So privacy isn't always the freest place for me to be. My liberty can collide with your liberty, and it certainly can trigger equity principles. We don't have the solutions. We have the framework for the kinds of things that we think that policymakers ought to be thinking about. And in my experience, you can get people from very different political perspectives to at least say, okay, now we're on the same agenda. But we may not arrive at the same policy at the end of this, but we may have some confidence that the people who put it together, thought about the right things. And I think these are the right things to think about.
See, and then just to add to that, the more you understand through a slightly different lens, the more you understand about mechanism and sort of the rational basis, then you know when you are alone in your liberty versus not. And then it becomes very, very clear.
Right.
And it's all cost benefit. It's all cost benefit, I think, all the way down. It's just the different things that you're measuring. Sorry, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah.
That was well said. I have nothing to add to this. Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. This concludes the end of the formal part of our program. As I indicated at the beginning, Professors Massaro and Padot and Dr. Slepian are willing to stay on. We do have a few other questions that we didn't get to, so I'll be happy to ask them of our panelists, plus a few more. But otherwise, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's, not too many people have dropped off. So let's go ahead and ask.
Take off our jackets now.
Yeah, take off your jacket. Well, it looks like they're still recording, so you might want to leave your jacket on. But let's just get right back at it. We've got a few more questions. In fact, a couple that have come in to me. How extensive is the governor's authority to issue executive orders closing businesses due to the pandemic? So a very practical question here.
You want me to take that one?
Probably
no
one does,
but let me do it.
Thanks, Dean Massaro.
Let me walk through it. Clunk, clunk. First of all, it would be an exercise of state power. And the states, traditionally, they operate in the zone. They're the primary actors to protect health, safety, and welfare under our Constitution. These are reserved powers to the states, and it's sort of frontline. And health is a traditional area of state control. It's always been active in this. And by the way, this is not our first pandemic rodeo, and there will be more ahead. Public health crises are not stealing upon an unsuspecting legislature or governor or American people. These are things we know something about. Of course, the federal government has power too, but let me put that to one side for now. Governor Ducey. Okay, now you move from state power to branches of government, right? He's in the executive branch, which means the legislature, leads in the creation of laws, and the governor is in the executive branch, executes the laws. And so just like with President Trump, it's important for Governor Ducey to track his authority to something that the legislature has authorized or that falls within the inherent power of a governor. It's certainly within the power of the governor to draft an executive order, as he has done in this crisis. But the backdrop here is that the Arizona legislature, like every other legislature, has already thought about this in advance and given this governor, as well as governors in other states, their legislatures, power to act in emergencies, including health crises. There's a lattice work of state law. And within that lattice work, now Governor Ducey is operating, I think, within the boundaries of the authority that he's been given there. Where some disagree, and their good points they're making, is they worry that the authority given to Governor Ducey is too broad, and there aren't enough conditions on it. It's like there are no intelligible principles, and that may violate separation of powers. Similar debates going on at the federal level. But generally speaking, he's operating in the sweet spot of state power with considerable legislative blessing in a pandemic. And he is delivering a lot of the law gives a lot of control, not just to him himself, but the Arizona Department of Health Services. So he's not operating in splendid isolation on this either. So I think that, the short answer is I think he does have this authority, but the authority has to be implemented in a way that's consonant with the fundamental rights we've talked about earlier, the procedural values, et cetera. If some of the lawyers on the call looked at the applicable Arizona law, I think you'd see it tracks a heck of a lot of what we've been talking about here as intuitive things that ought to operate even in an emergency. The Constitution is not a suicide pact, right? And yet in an emergency, we don't abandon the Constitution or the rule of law. And so far, I think the chief executive, I may disagree, I do, with how he's operated in terms of exercising his power, but I think it is within his power. Including the power to close down non-essential services in the throes of a pandemic. Last point that makes this tough is the persistence of this problem. Emergencies we think of, when's it over? Well, after 9/11, I thought that too. And we still have red days, orange days, yellow days. So, we have some familiarity with persistent crises as well, and the complicated ways in which governance has to go on. And there will be lawsuits. There is one. I think that there's bars suing, saying that some of these orders are a violation of their rights. We'll see what the courts say.
Right. So let's stick with government for a moment with this next question/comment about the government leading the nation during this pandemic, and the fact that this person writes that we need a national policy. There's not a national narrative, and how do we proceed through this misinformation that we find ourselves in?
I mean, again, I go back to the science. I think that people, the negative aspect of COVID is clearly the morbidity, mortality that we're seeing, and as well as all the strife. But the positive has been this connectivity. And I understand that it may be very uneven as far as different groups not having access to information and all that. But for many people who do have access to information, get informed. There are plenty of sites that are very respectable, university sites, the other sites that we talked about, to learn some of the basics. And speak to your physician as well. I would do that. I mean, we're all very connected now with our patients. Reality is that what used to be, I'll see you in 3 to 6 months, we're on the phone. We're doing these types of things. So I think that the barrier of information has gone down for many people. I understand it may not be even for every member of society, but certainly there's a diffusional effect that also can be helpful. And it's a grassroots, factory floor up effect that I think needs to be mounted.
Let me just jump in quickly on part of it. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think that the federal government, even in an ideal world, should be the sole or the primary developer of policy for a situation like this. Really, you need coordination amongst all facets of government, local government, state government, perhaps regional cooperation among states, federal government, and international. And the reason is that sort of the further you drill down, the more policy responses can be sensitive to the specific context within a jurisdiction, right? The city of Tucson faces different sets of issues than rural towns in Arizona, perhaps, and has a different set of sort of a different populace with different political interests. And I mean, there's a lot of ways in which Tucson can tailor a response, but we can't only operate in isolation because we don't stay put. There's so much integration at the state level, at the national level, that we need to sort of be operating in as coordinated a fashion as we can at all of these levels. When one piece of that government puzzle is not willing or able to coordinate in the way that we would like, I think the others can do they have to make do. I mean, we have lots of places at which sort of lots of types of government and private institutions as well, right? All of these are loci for deciding the rules of the road in the pandemic. And I think we have seen over the last month sort of an iterative process where sometimes states are out front, sometimes cities are out front, sometimes the federal government participates, sometimes it participates less. And so, I mean, I think that is the right model, sort of a multimodal integrated approach that brings in sort of all these tiers of government.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. What have each of you observed in terms of some of the disparate impacts of COVID, specifically that you have observed?
Well, let me jump in on the medical side. I mean, I've clearly seen a lot of differences as far as, speaking internationally in terms of connectivity. Different groups are being affected speaking nationally, speaking state-wise, what we've seen in different economic groups that are much more at risk, that it does track, economic disparity issues. Certain groups may have other propensity for that than there are risk groups that clearly are being hit hard. But there's the flip side of this. The flip side is, that other diseases continue to progress. And the collateral damage of COVID is the fact that it has changed everything. It's changed our practices, our normal activities, but medically it's also allowed other chronic diseases to really fester and get worse. I mean, we've had individuals come in complaining of symptoms, and it's really due to cardiovascular disease that hasn't been treated adequately just because of the impact of staying at home and not doing all that. In fact, those numbers are now a groundswell that's going to explode because of a lot of these things. And similarly, renal disease and other manifestations. So the fact that it's created an imbalance in the normal throughput of care for many other groups with the top 20 diagnoses that normally we would see in the hospital, that's going to have a sort of a whammo effect. That's another wave that's going to happen soon.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you, Dr. Slepian. Dean Massaro?
Well, I alluded to it earlier. They're the knowns. People in nursing homes, the elderly, other kinds of foreseeable disparate impacts that are becoming manifest. But they tend to, and at the end of the paper we talk about this. The COVID crisis, again, this is not new, but it's laid bare pre-existing systemic inequities that will aggravate different populations' ability to respond to something of this nature. I'm on the work with the HARI program here on campus, which is interested in environmental and social justice. And we, like many, many units on campus, have mobilized to try to respond to the crisis by responding to the most hard hit. An example I gave earlier was the Navajo Nation. There are intergenerational households, that is, they're living together, the elderly with the younger, many, many homes without electricity, running water, or broadband access, things of that sort. And so, that impact for them has been tremendous. And there are other narratives. I mean, all you have to do is read a good paper to track some of these consequences, plus all the people who couldn't stay home, essential workers, right? The people who deliver your groceries. It's just, I think one only has to open one's eyes to the things that he or she is doing or they are doing in order to respond to this and say, what would it be like if I had to respond to this without resources, or was living someplace else, or just didn't have the tools?
Right, perfect.
Plus, we're differentially vulnerable to disease. And we know this, anybody knows this. Some people are more at risk for some types of cancer than other types of cancer. So this also is not, a news flash. And so we're not all going to suffer from a pathogen in the same way that someone else might.
That's right. Thank you, Dean.
To jump in on that, I mean, we're both differentially susceptible to the disease. And I think this is implicit in what Professor Massaro was saying. We're also differentially able to protect ourselves because, those with greater resources and greater flexibility can protect themselves more. And those who have fewer constraints on their life can, so just make that really concrete. We have students who it's not that challenging for them to participate in classes online. They have broadband access. They don't have parents or children at home. They have plenty of resources to get themselves food and other things, so they're not having to go out and work. And then we have students who are on the other side of that spectrum. They have no broadband access. They are caring for sick parents. They're caring for children. They're now in different time zones because they're international students who've gone halfway around the world to return home, right? So there's, in just a very concrete way, both our susceptibility, but the effect of responding to the virus falls very differentially as well.
And I will add to that as well. I oversee a staff of nearly 20 professionals, some of whom can do their jobs 100% remotely. Some of them can do their jobs, say 40, 50, 60% remotely. Some absolutely need to be in the building to do their jobs. And it's a real struggle as a leader of this group to figure out what's fair for everyone, and to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. It's a real struggle, and a real struggle for them, many of whom have childcare issues and other family obligations, and people at home who may not be who are more susceptible. So it's a real struggle every day, I think, for everyone, right? So
if I can just say, there you're onto something, because on my experience in working with the law school team on this and working out from it, and one of the questions was, what do we do when we don't have the leadership that we want or need? Well, demand it, but also model it. And I think, everybody here has got a computer, and everybody here has had the bandwidth to beam onto this discussion today. And I think you're all situated in locations in which you can be part of our little framework. You can model it. And I think it's rationality, rights, equality, but also empathy and responsibility. And I think that that's not rocket science, even though it seems like it in some moments now. And if you want to get facts, don't just read opinions. You go after the facts. I think that the tools are there. We just have to do it ourselves. And I've got private rants. Everyone who knows me knows that. But my public responsibilities are another thing. And so I think what we've been trying to do in this essay is talk about those public responsibilities and see if we can model those in our daily lives, even in our very private lives, our families, and other zones of agreement and disagreement.
that's right, which is a perfect segue into maybe another question about the framework, and how has the framework that you've laid out today, the constitutional framework, informed your planning on our new Safe Return Committee?
Well, I think it started with, first of all, an equity approach for all. It also started with a science-forward approach, And again, I thank everybody for being involved. I thank Dean Miller, who said, I know you have a million things to do, but you need 1,000,001. You must have 1,000,001. So we're on the committee. Of course, I would be on it. But I think, we've all put together a very rational, thoughtful, evenly distributed approach, which I think addresses issues even to a higher level of scrutiny and involvement than what the university has put. It's always good to do more, as long as you have a good framework that comports with some consistency across the institution, which it does. And I think, it's dynamic. Like people have always said, a great plan is a plan, and then it will evolve. And I think we've made it flexible and nimble. Those are the words. We've seen that in the document as well. So, but we do have to live in this environment. This environment will go on. I think the shame on us, shame on you angle comes in from the perspective of, if we don't learn from this in the big picture, government particularly, I can't imagine. Basically, the United States has the best science and understanding of this type of situation, yet we failed miserably. And we should not do that. And it really points out very clearly the need for an interdigitation of science and government. We put in the term there of sort of anachronistic synchrony, where we were off in terms of thinking in an old way, and we're not synced to where we are today. And also the fact that communication and really putting in greater public health measures. We are a victim of technology. This type of stuff has been going on for thousands of years. In fact, there is data that coronaviruses go back to 8,000 BCE. When people look at genetics and other things, they've been around. But the reality is their airplanes didn't go back to 8,000 BCE. So suddenly a virus hops on a plane, and next thing you know, it's in your living room. And we have to be able to deal with that. That's going to continue. But it's totally surmountable. And there will be drugs, and there will be vaccines and other things. But if we let this happen again, I rest my case.
Thank you, Dr. Slepian. Professor Massaro or Prideaux, would you like to comment?
I've had my say, but I don't think, it's interesting the word shame. I think it will be a shame, and it will be shameful if we don't take better steps. I don't think shaming is likely to be the right technique.
Agree on that.
I think we've already, the disunity part of this puzzle, and people in good faith struggling with this horrible thing that's happened to them and to their families and to their lives and their livelihood. That just isn't, it needs to drop out of it. And that's what we're trying to do in the paper. It may sound a little Pollyanna-ish, but you need to pick a path regardless. This is the path I favor, and that's why.
And I guess just to make it really concrete, as we apply this in our planning, I think partially we've been attentive and we've thought a lot about the burdens that our plan will impose on individuals. We have created a lot of flexibility for individuals, students in particular, who don't want to participate in the mitigation measures, to participate in education remotely, so that we've said if you want to be in the building, this is what you have to do, but we will make sure you can get a high quality legal education not coming into the building if you object to what we've done. We've thought a lot about how we could try to address some of the equality issues that our students are facing in terms of broadband access, other types of access issues. Those are hard questions and we don't have perfect answers for them. We don't even always have good answers for them, but we really attended to them and we're trying to figure out how to do it right. And on the rationality front, I mean, every intervention is incredibly complicated, even the most minor, and we have discussed them. So let me give you one very concrete example. We had a long conversation about whether we wanted to essentially have the doors to the law school key card activated only, so that each student would have to swipe their key to get into the building. That would have the benefit of reducing the number of outside people who don't have business at the law school coming, sort of give us a little bit more of a contained bubble, maybe help with some contact tracing because we would have a record of who's entering and who's leaving. But at the same time, it would mean every student has to touch the handle to the door, and it might be creating lines and creating greater proximity. So just that question, do you lock the door or not, has huge trade-offs on all sides. And I don't know, we spent an hour on the committee hashing that through. Did we get it right? I don't know, but I think that's the right approach. The right approach is to think carefully in a clear-eyed fashion about what the trade-offs are, be able to articulate why you came to the decision you did in a way that is attentive to the liberty and equality ramifications.
And it also betrays a value. I mean, that's deliberative democracy in action. It is again, the Constitution reflects more than creates these kinds of positive values or processes, but they matter. I've gone into many of these, we call them rounds because Dr. Slepian is guiding us through it. Thinking I know, oh, this is the way we ought to do it. And with the quality of discussion at the end, I'm thinking, maybe not, and I do think you arrive at better outcomes, certainly more justifiable outcomes, publicly justifiable and defensible, where people are more likely to trust you. And that goes back to the really key point that Justin made up at the top of the thing, is that this is going to depend on cooperation. It just is. And so it's going to matter that we can tell you how we arrived at these determinations, might give you more confidence in them than if we just said we threw some darts at the wall. We had a lot of other stuff to do. Our air conditioning works, and we wish the dean would give this to somebody else. That's not what happened. We stepped up, and I'm sure everybody on this call has had to step up. That's where we're at.
And I think it's worth noting here that Teresa and another person, Bernadette, have been our fearless leaders on this. And so a huge amount of credit. We're talking about a paper that the three of us wrote, but the committee was driven by the leadership of Teresa and Bernadette, who have just been unbelievably capable, sophisticated, welcoming, and able to get a bunch of law professors and others to think hard about issues and hash them through in the way that Tony was just describing.
Leadership matters. Yeah, and in Teresa's case, she arrived here in April. Oh, I'm so sorry. And was thrown into this. Wasn't it like the week you arrived from Yale?
It was my third week, actually.
Oh,
So
well, then,
I had plenty of time to acclimate. Right. Well, it's been an honor to work with everyone, and I appreciate the kind words. It's been a true team effort, without a doubt. Everyone has just been working tirelessly around the clock on many of these issues, which I think is a perfect segue into the very last question that's come in, and that is with the current spike here in Arizona and in other parts of the country, are we doomed in our entire endeavor to return to campus?
We're not doomed. First of all, we're not doomed in the big picture. We're not doomed in the return effort. You know, I've used these analogies that this planning is like planning to dock a giant ocean liner, a big boat. If you don't do it right, you blow out the pier and half the city. But we have to operate like a speedboat. At the last minute, you have to turn on a dime. So we planned for the worst case, where we'd still, even if everyone arrived on campus and we said, sorry, you can't come into the building. We've got all the mechanisms in place to be able to effectively deliver good education and continue the academic mission of the academy, et cetera. On the other hand, we put in the protective measures that would work. This will vary, this will change over time. You know, we're really in the first wave of where we are in Arizona. And, but if we all adhere to the plan, and if the larger state adheres to some of this distancing and lockdown a little bit and containment, remember, there is no virus without a host. So if the host goes away or separates out, this is going to diminish. So I think it hasn't been for naught. And I think that at the end of the day, we'll be back in some fashion, but we'll at least know how to operate in every range from fully in to fully out.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Slepian. You know, I also read early on in our planning a wonderful essay about that this is going to be a dance. We're going to get closer, we're going to move away, we're going to move in again and move out, similar to your speedboat analogy. And I think we've been planning for all sorts of contingencies along the way so that we can get closer. And then if we have to move out again, we can do that. It's been challenging. It's been exhausting. It's been rewarding at the same time. So I want to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful paper, for the time they've spent with us today, engaging with the community on the constitutional norms around our planning for a safe return to campus. And finally, thanks to everyone who has attended in our larger community. We have learned so much from you. We have received literally hundreds of submissions to our virtual suggestion boxes, where members of our community have expressed to us, to this committee, their concerns, their suggestions, their ideas, and it has truly shaped how we've drafted this plan, how we continue to revise this plan. This is going to be a never-ending process. Well, hopefully not never-ending. This is going to be an ongoing process. As long as we have coronavirus, we will continue our planning. So thank you all, and have a wonderful Thursday afternoon. Thank you.